Welcome to Hub History, where we go far beyond the Freedom Trail to share our favorite stories from the history of Boston, the hub of the universe. This is episode 183, Black Radical, with Kerri Greenidge. Hi, I'm Jake. From his Harvard graduation in 1895 to his death in 1934, William Monroe Trotter was one of the most influential and uncompromising advocates for the rights of Black Americans. He was a leader who had the vision to co-found groups like the Niagara Movement and the NAACP. But he also had an ego that prevented him from working effectively within the movements that he started. He was a critic of Booker T. Washington and an early ally of Marcus Garvey. Monroe Trotter was the publisher of the influential Black newspaper, The Boston Guardian, and he's the subject of a new biography by Tufts Professor Kerri Greenidge called Black Radical: The Life and Times of William Monroe Trotter. But before Kerri joins me to talk about the book, it's time for this week's upcoming historical event. For our upcoming event this week, we're featuring a Boston History Happy Hour brought to you by us. We couldn't find any upcoming virtual events in the next couple of weeks on any of the many event calendars we usually check, so we decided to host one. On Friday, May 15th, join us at 5:30 p.m. to nerd out on Boston history. If we can't go to the bar, we're going to bring the bar to you with Boston History Bar Trivia. Fire up your webcam, pour your favorite beverage, and join a happening socially distanced party. If you're in, check out the show notes this week at hubhistory.com/183 for instructions on how to join. We'll probably have you submit your email address and send out a link so that we reduce our chances of getting Zoom bombed. Don't worry though, we won't spam you. We don't even have a mailing list. Oh crap, should I be starting a mailing list? Now, longtime listeners know that this is the point in an episode where I pause and I ask you to support the show on Patreon. Thanks to COVID-19, a lot of people are seeing their hours get cut or even losing their jobs altogether. Don't feel bad if you're not able to support us right now. Even if you are doing okay financially, please consider getting takeout from your favorite local restaurant, order a book from a local bookstore, or make a small donation to your favorite local history museum or a history organization. After all that, if you're still in a position to do so, please consider helping us create Hub History. Just go to patreon.com/hubhistory or go to hubhistory.com and click on the support link. Thanks for your support in this pandemic season. And now it's time for this week's main topic. Kerri Greenidge is an associate professor in the Department of Race, Colonialism, and Diaspora at Tufts University. She's also the author of Black Radical: The Life and Times of William Monroe Trotter, which was published in November 2019. Kerri Greenidge, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
I have invited you here today to talk about your new book, Black Radical: The Life and Times of William Monroe Trotter. And if I was going to hang up on you right now, I could walk out my front door and in about 10 minutes, probably, I could walk to Monroe Trotter's grave. And yet I had never heard of him until just the past 2 or 3 years. To the extent that I hear Monroe Trotter mentioned, he's usually mentioned as a foil or an antagonist to Booker T. Washington, but he doesn't come out of nowhere to challenge Washington. If you can start us from the beginning, can you tell us how the Trotter family ended up moving to Massachusetts and to Hyde Park?
Well, thank you for that. I do believe that Trotter is overlooked even amongst people who study African-American history and the African-American radical tradition. So Trotter was born in 1872, actually in Chillicothe, Ohio. His father was James Monroe Trotter, and his father was born enslaved in Mississippi, in a little town called Grand Gulf. And his father, James Monroe Trotter, born in 1842, escaped from slavery with his mother in the late 1840s, became a lieutenant in the Massachusetts 55th Regiment, and moved to Boston in 1865, and married a fellow woman from Ohio named Virginia Isaacs. And Virginia Isaacs was the daughter of free people from Charlottesville, Virginia, who were descendants of enslaved people in Charlottesville and at Thomas Jefferson's Monticello. Mm-hmm. And so his parents in antebellum America came from a long line of people who rooted their radical political outlook within the Black community itself, and particularly within the fight against enslavement. And his father moved to Massachusetts because his father, James Trotter, got a job in the federal post office in 1865. And this was a position that was provided for a handful, approximately 6 in Boston, of Black veterans of the Union Army who were given posts in the federal government. So his father got his job in Station A in Boston, which was the busiest federal post office in the city of Boston. And he moved his wife and eventually his son, who was born in Chillicothe and then brought as an infant to Boston. So they made their way to Boston, and they became part of a burgeoning Black middle and upper class within the city of Boston and across New England that rose in the years after the Civil War.
And I would just, as a sidebar, encourage our readers, or our listeners, I should say, to go back to our episode 154, as I checked as you were just speaking, for our interview with Dr. Millington Bergeson Lockwood.
Oh, yes. Wonderful work. Yep.
And he discusses James Trotter's career in a lot of detail in that book.
Yes.
So when the family moves here to the Boston area, they settle in the Reedville neighborhood in Hyde Park. And you describe in the book that they really struggled to rent or buy a house here in Hyde Park, despite being, by that time, a fairly well-to-do family. Why was that?
Hyde Park at the time, post-Civil War, was still considered its own town. Mm-hmm. And it was very a country town, really up until the late 19th century. And so James Trotter really fell in love with the Reedville section because that's where Camp Meigs was. And Camp Meigs was where he trained with the 55th Massachusetts Regiment when he enlisted in 1863. So he really liked Hyde Park. He thought it was beautiful. He also did not like Boston City proper, which was known as a place of really kind of hard living, and particularly for African Americans and segregation. Mm-hmm. And so he saw Hyde Park. He decided to move there. Hyde Park at that time, the 1870s, had a small yet growing cohort of liberal white Protestant reformers. Theodore Weld, who was a veteran of the abolitionist movement, lived in Fairmount, which is where the Trotters eventually moved. And so when Trotter originally came to Hyde Park, he rented a house from a family called the Leverett family, who were known to rent to African Americans. But a lot of the people who sold their property would not sell to African Americans. One of the few people who did was a woman named Mehitable Sunderland, who herself was a former abolitionist, and she would rent to people, although she discouraged people Black people from buying. And it really wasn't until 1873 when there was a depression, one of the most drastic depressions of the 19th century. And many of the people who had purchased house lots in Hyde Park basically sold off their property to gain to salvage whatever money they could. And that's how he ended up being able to purchase 2 properties on Williams Avenue in Hyde Park. And
he goes on to leverage that experience in real estate into essentially a real estate business for much of the rest of his life, right?
Yes. So James Trotter, in addition to his job with the post office, and then he left the post office eventually, he invested in purchasing property throughout 1873 and into the 1880s. So he had properties by the end of his life in 1892. James Trotter had properties in Dorchester and in Roxbury. And he had the 2 homes in Hyde Park, and he had an additional home in Hyde Park that he owned. And he left these to his wife when he passed in 1892.
Well, if those were in Fairmount Hill, I wish I had that many properties in Fairmount Hill today.
Exactly.
I'm not sure exactly how to ask this question, but you note in the book that Monroe, and William Monroe Trotter was known, I guess, at the time by his middle name Monroe primarily, right? Mm-hmm. So you note that he stood out as being a very light-skinned boy. Mm-hmm. Do you think his complexion changed how he experienced sort of the background day-to-day racism that people would have experienced in late 19th century Hyde Park or Boston?
That's actually an interesting question. I think that he himself, compared to the rest of the family, was actually darker than in complexion than his sisters and his mother.
Interesting.
And he and his father were both darker than his mother and his two sisters. Small Black community that was in Hyde Park and also in neighboring areas of Dedham was a Black community that was predominantly people of lighter skin tone. And New England in general, at the end of the Civil War, was known as an area of the country where about 1/3 of all African Americans were defined as mulatto. Now, what that means, we have to kind of think in 19th century terms, that could mean they were actually of mixed race, or it could mean that they were people who had a lighter complexion. So most African Americans in Boston at the time, although members of the upper class were definitely lighter in complexion predominantly than people who were of the working classes. In Boston in particular, it was known as a city where so many of the Black community were defined as mulatto, again, which is a derogatory term in today's terms, but was the term that they used. Those who were known as that, as being lighter skinned, were, 1/3 of the population. So his experience with racism, particularly in Hyde Park, was one that wasn't any worse than his neighbors, but also wasn't any better. The one thing he did have was that his father was well known in the town. And one of the things I point out in the book is that, much like a lot of things in Boston's history, racism and racial animus kind of changes over time. And so Trotter Sr. was very well respected in Hyde Park. He was actually the lamplighter in the city in the last years of his life. And he was a member of the Integrated Grand Army of the Republic. So kind of on the surface of it, and this was one of the things I say in the book, their lives, particularly compared to other parts of New England and other parts of the country, were pretty respected and kind of in this bubble in Hyde Park. But as you allude to in the book, he and his sisters were called names. He was often the only Black kid in his class, where he was bullied by other students for being Black. So it's kind of this dance, I call it, kind of in New England and in Boston history, where you have, on one hand, kind of this liberal, racial, and tolerant history generally, but on the individual level, there's often sort of acts of racial aggression, and then kind of systemically, there's also racial inequity.
Well, you mentioned Monroe Trotter's education. I do want to touch on that because while he later in life will live for a long time in Dorchester, he'll settle sort of in the South End, Lower Roxbury area. All his formative years, his growing up years, are all in Hyde Park, if I had that correct.
Yes.
So he graduates from Hyde Park High, which generations later is then at the heart of the busing crisis in Boston.
Yes. But
I think it was a very different Hyde Park High at the time Monroe Trotter went there. What was his educational experience like?
So Monroe Trotters attended the Hyde Park schools, and this is the 1870s and 1880s. And Hyde Park was actually known, because it was a country town, it was really known as having some of the best schools in the state, public schools. And most of the schools were attended by the children of white Protestant Brahmin, middle class or upper middle class white children. This changed drastically by even the 1890s, but there was like this window of period from, roughly 1850s through the 1880s when Trotter was a child. So the public schools were very good. The resources within that school system were very good. He joined his first temperance league as a junior high school student. He participated in the yearly concerts that all the school children in Hyde Park gave to the town. And so he was a very gifted student, which was recognized very early. His name is in local Hyde Park newspapers and Norfolk Gazettes from the time he's 7 up until he graduates. He graduated in 1890. And wanted to become a minister. His father, however, told him that to become a minister was to basically be resigned to segregated pulpits, where his parishioners would not get the same resources. And so Trotter applied to Harvard. He got into Harvard, attended 1891, graduated Phi Beta Kappa in 1895 from Harvard, and never ranked below third in his class.
Wow.
And was at Harvard. The lowest grade he actually received, ironically, was in English. But the rest of his career was stellar. And he basically was somebody who saw Harvard as a link to fellow African American elite thinkers, and that's really what launched his public political career.
One detail that I would have never known without reading the book is that James Trotter, although he encouraged Monroe to go to Harvard, he didn't offer to pay the tuition, although I think he did for his sisters.
Yes, and it's one of those dynamics when I was researching the book that was fascinating was that, the traditional narrative for scholars who looked at Trotter was that, he's like this favored son of his father, James Monroe Trotter. And actually, James Monroe Trotter was very clear in the few writings we have that his daughters, Monroe's sisters, he had a sister named Bessie, who was the youngest, who was born in 1883. And then he had another sister named Maud. And so both of those sisters were basically adored. They got kind of all the accoutrements of like an upper middle class life. They were encouraged to, piano lessons. And his sister, when James Trotter died in 1892, he left a large sum of money for the girls' education. But he was really kind of this tough love approach to Monroe, which was that he was going to pay his own way, and that any money he would get was kind of put into the bank and administered by James Monroe Trotter's wife, Monroe's mother.
So how did Monroe make ends meet and manage to pay for a Harvard education?
Well, he basically applied for scholarships. He worked. So he actually, one of his jobs was selling desks in Hyde Park. He lived in the cheapest dorm at the time. And so he worked throughout his time in Harvard, and paid his own way, his own tuition. And then when he graduated, he, being Black, he found it very difficult to get a job that matched his Harvard degree. He wasn't sort of called back by anybody in 1895. And so he went and founded his own real estate firm, which was very lucrative. One of the most lucrative real estate firms in the city, in Boston at the time. And that's what sort of allowed him to have, for a time at least, the disposable income to start his newspaper.
By the time Monroe Trotter was at Harvard, you say he's making connections with other African Americans and becoming what we'd consider an African American radical thinker. By that time, obviously, Booker T. Washington wouldn't have known about a snot-nosed Harvard kid, but Washington must have been looming very large in the lives of Trotter and his cohort. And the conservatism of Washington must have played a large role in forming their outlooks. Yeah.
So one of the things, Booker T. Washington founded a Tuskegee Institute in 1881. And throughout the 1880s, Washington was really known as the rising leader amongst the African American population in the aftermath of Reconstruction. And part of that was due to, if sort of the literature on Washington would support this, was due to the way that Washington approached or did not approach politics. So Washington's rhetoric was that African Americans, newly freed from slavery, needed to forego participation in electoral politics and concentrate instead on racial uplift, which is the notion that, education and pull yourself up by your bootstraps and get a skill. And that basically that would then lead to an end to the very sort of violent racial violence that was occurring in the South during and after Reconstruction. So that was Washington's program. And through that, he gained a lot of support from New Englanders, particularly very, very wealthy industrialists, who gave money to Tuskegee Institute and to transform Washington into really the most powerful Black man in America until his death in 1915. And Trotter and his cohorts knew about Washington. So they're all part of kind of this little small cadre of college-educated or college teaching African Americans across the country. But Trotter's main criticism of Booker T. Washington, which, as Trotter pointed out, many elite African Americans had at the time, was that he basically sold, as Trotter would say, his race for a mess of pottage, that he was more interested in appeasing white racism and the American racial system than he was with confronting it, and that he was more likely than not to sympathize with the virulent, violent white supremacist violence that was occurring across the South and across the country at the time. Trotter's belief was that the average African-American person, particularly in the northern cities, was being harmed directly by Washington's rhetoric. And he had a lot of evidence to support that, as I point out in the book. And not only that, but that Washington could not possibly be a leader because he was tasked with the impossible goal, as W.E.B. Du Bois put it, of being a leader for white people about how Black people were experiencing the world, right? And so Trotter was very adamant that Washington did that role well, but he could not possibly meet the needs and the demands of African-American people.
Now, before long, Trotter's going to have some very public confrontations with Washington. But before we get there, some things have to change. So we're 1895, he's going to graduate from Harvard. 1896, he's a real estate investor. 1899, he gets married to a young woman named Geraldine Pindell and moves to suburban Dorchester. You said it was very hard to research their romance and the relationship, or I guess Deanie's early life and then the relationship between the two of them. Why was that such a challenge?
Well, one of the things, there are letters in which Trotter talks about his relationship with Deanie, and he talks about definitely his love for her. One of the things I point out in the book, though, is that Trotter was definitely a misogynist, for better or for worse. He grew up believing that the women in his life, particularly his sisters, his mother, and his wife, were kind of the people who were supposed to constantly support his newspaper publishing. And so one of the things I point to in the book is that I surmise, and, I don't have any proof of this except for the lack of information we have about her from Trotter, is that he really didn't talk much about his wife except for in her capacity as helping him. And given the records for all women, but particularly African American women in the late 19th century, it's very difficult to trace her history. We know that she was related to the Pindells, who were a Black family from Maryland who migrated to Boston in the 1850s. Her father attended Harvard briefly in the 1870s and then left and became a hairdresser and then eventually worked in Cambridge, Massachusetts. She grew up in Everett. She lived in Revere for a little while, but we don't really know much about her background or her life because she also, so far as I can tell, did not leave like a diary or her own set of letters. Once she married Monroe in 1899, and he started The Guardian in 1901. Deanie, his wife, as she was called, basically became the person who ran the day-to-day of running a newspaper, like subscriptions and making sure people paid and the print and the type and all that type of stuff. So my suspicion is that part of that is due to because Deanie herself, as far as I can tell, now it could happen with the book coming out. People find, in some archive her writings or her stuff. But so far we haven't found any of her own writings about herself. And so therefore we have to rely on her from Trotter, who was often very sort of self-absorbed in terms of his own.
Right. So when they have her reflected in what he said as he's talking about himself, essentially.
Exactly.
So you mentioned the big change in 1901 is the founding of the Boston Guardian, this newspaper that Trotter will run for the rest of his life, and then Maude will run after that. And that gives him the platform that he then uses to gain national prominence, to be a critic of Washington's. How did he and a partner named George Forbes decide to get into newspaper publishing? Well,
Trotter's criticism was that the Black press, which began in 1827 in New York, amongst free African Americans, that the Black press had a particular role to play, and that was that it had to, as he said, hold a mirror up to nature. That's a Shakespeare quote. Basically had to be a conduit for challenging the status quo and agitating for racial justice rather than a medium to support the racial status quo. And so by the 1880s, the one newspaper that was still doing that was called the New York Age, and it was run out of New York by a man named T. Thomas Fortune. And that was the newspaper that Trotter grew up with, which had all these sort of very sophisticated political critiques of both the Democratic and Republican Party, of racial violence in the South, of labor, of the fact that Black people needed to become allied with labor interests. So that was the newspaper he grew up reading. And then by the 1890s, the editor of that paper, T. Thomas Fortune, came under the spell, so to speak, of Booker T. Washington, and Washington really changed the character of that paper. And there's evidence that Washington purposely brought up Black newspapers to control how African Americans were portrayed and to control any criticism of Tuskegee and of Booker T. Washington himself. So Trotter's first goal in becoming a newspaper man, as he writes to his friends in 1901, is that he was tired of seeing there being no independent venue that was talking about the realities of racial segregation, violence, and disfranchisement across the country. And so he wanted to create his own newspaper that would expose that. And as he said, tell colored people, as he called African Americans at the time, that they could decide their own political destiny, that they didn't have to kind of rely on the lies that were being spouted from Tuskegee and kind of the broader American context of racial segregation and disfranchisement.
I did find it interesting. You mentioned that Trotter used the word colored as a descriptor throughout his life. And I noticed that you, throughout the book, even when it's not a direct quote, used a lot of the 19th century language around race. Was that just so it wouldn't be jarring to switch back and forth in nomenclature?
Well, I really wanted the book to be about Black people and race in New England. And one of the things I wanted to make sure of and point out to kind of as a sub or a motif in the book is that the concept of race and the concept of Blackness, particularly at the end of the 19th century, was constantly changing and being framed by Black people themselves. And so Trotter was somebody who believed that the term colored described the vast ethnicities and cultural backgrounds of African Americans at the end of the Civil War, right? He pointed out that, 10% of all Black Bostonians throughout his life were foreign born, right? And so what did that mean if they came from Caribbean or they came from Cape Verde, and they defined themselves differently. So he thought that colored people was the way to define that. And he also was very attuned to the fact that in addition to being foreign born, New England's Black population had a large minority of people who were of some form of mixed race or identified as a mixed race. So he really believed that Blackness was defined by being inherently international, full of different ethnic groups of people, and kind of composed of people who came from the African diaspora as opposed to the term Negro.
And we'll probably talk about this more a little down the road, but it seems like most of his career is spent trying to build all-encompassing organizations, sort of these broad Pan-African movements. It was very optimistic whether or not it ever worked out very well for him. Yes.
I mean, he really saw that particularly in the American South, African Americans were disfranchised by 1900 and, subject to horrendous racial violence and discrimination and segregation. And so he saw that Black people in the North, or colored people outside of the South, as he called them, had an obligation to use what little power they had in places like Massachusetts or New York to put political pressure on both the Democratic and the Republican parties at the time. And he really saw this, as his career progressed, as something that was encompassed all people who were the victims of some form of colonialism, either in the Caribbean or in Africa, and that they were united in their need to politically agitate for their rights and for justice.
Before he gets to that point, he obviously has to build a platform for himself and to create a name and reputation for himself. So how does he use The Guardian to start creating a public profile for himself, and what sort of issues is he using The Guardian to tackle in the early years?
So the first thing he's focused on, and in the first years, and really throughout the paper, but definitely in the first decade, is enforcement of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which were passed after the Civil War, and by the end of Reconstruction were nullified, weakened by state governments across the country, but particularly in the former Confederacy. And so his idea was that, slavery had been abolished, rights of citizenship came from the 14th Amendment, and that the 14th Amendment was being violated by the Supreme Court's very narrow interpretation of what, equal protection covered. He also pointed to the 15th Amendment, which gave Black men the right to vote. And he argued that enforcement of those amendments was kind of the pinnacle of getting rights for African American people in the United States. And this was at a time when southern states in particular were doing things like in Mississippi, violently overthrowing the duly elected government and instead replacing it with avowed white supremacists who then, in their constitution, disenfranchised the Black population, right? And so he was arguing that America actually had pieces of judicial, oversight, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, that could be interpreted and should be interpreted to protect rights of African Americans, that those amendments were not being used in that way. So that was fundamentally his focus. How did he harness this in terms of activism? The first thing he did was he was very tuned into reports from Black communities about what the immediate effects of ignoring the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendment had done. So he chronicled lynchings, borrowing from the work of Ida B. Wells Barnett, covered instances of African Americans trying to continue to vote in the South and being violently repressed, covered instances of racial injustice across the country and across the, particularly across the South, as a way to document what was actually occurring as a result of rejection or nullification of the Reconstruction Amendments. And then he was very good at organizing and galvanizing crowds of people to show up and to protest in a fashion that people were not used to seeing in the late 19th or early 20th century. So, for instance, in 1902, there was a case of a Black man named Monroe Trotter who was accused of burning down a white man's barn in North Carolina. Rogers fled to Massachusetts. He is then pursued by the authorities in North Carolina. And Trotter and his followers argued that the 14th Amendment would be violated by Monroe Trotter being sent back to what would have been a certain lynching in North Carolina. And that whole case was built around his commitment to the 14th Amendment, but also his commitment to the public, the Black public, rallying around a cause that could eventually lead to emancipation and freedom for the entire race.
So he's leading that effort in 1902, and then by 1903, there is what's characterized as the Boston Riot. Mm-hmm. That's led, at least, or ring-led by Monroe Trotter, and that's probably one of the things that he's most remembered for now, although it's really just one incident in a very long career.
Yes.
What happened at this famous 1903 meeting at the Zion AME Church in Boston that we end up remembering as the Boston Riot?
By 1903, Trotter, the Guardian had been around for almost 2 years. And in that time, Trotter's main call was for an organization that he was referring to as the National Equal Rights League. And what he wanted to happen was he wanted African Americans to question their allegiance to the Republican Party, which of course was considered the party of Lincoln. He pointed out, as many Northern African Americans pointed out, that the GOP had failed in upholding the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. He also was critical of the Democratic Party, which at the time was the party of the segregationist South. And so Trotter really called for a bold, what he called political independence, and that African Americans should vote for the interests of their race and their communities rather than partisanship. And so he goes to New York. He went to Louisville to try to get this platform submitted before what was called the Afro-American Council, which was the nominal civil rights group run by Booker T. Washington and T. Thomas Fortune. And every time he showed up for those meetings, he and his supporters were basically shot down by Washington. Washington would say they couldn't speak, or he'd tell Trotter the meeting started at like 6 and then said it would start at 3 and Trotter would show up and it would be over. So Trotter's way to handle that was that he published a series of questions, 9 questions that he had directly for Booker T. Washington, basically along the lines of, how has your leadership made life better for African Americans? And of course, Trotter would say it hasn't. In July 1903, Washington came to Boston for a celebration of Washington's National Negro Business League, and this was founded in Boston. It was the premier organization for Black businessmen in the country. And Washington comes to Boston to give a planned speech at the AME Church, and Trotter showed up aiming to basically disrupt the meeting by asking his questions. And in the midst of this, members and supporters of Trotter's newspaper, who were very vocal and very passionate, basically stormed the dais. And what the press referred to as the Boston riot was that Trotter was arrested and his supporters were arrested by the police department for disturbing the peace. Washington tries to speak and eventually confronts, Pepper on the dais, and he starts sneezing, and so then the crowd starts laughing and all this type of thing, and the crowd then surges forward and starts yelling at Washington and demanding that his questions be asked. And so Trotter, for that, was put into jail for 30 days. For disturbing the peace. He's put on trial, and he emerged from that as having this, as I call it in the book, kind of this local, but also this national celebrity, right? For being somebody, his supporters would argue, who had, challenged power, been the first person to point out that Booker T. Washington's politics were not accepted by all African Americans, and that, in fact, Booker T. Washington's rhetoric was harmful to that community.
And I'll point out to listeners that Charles Street Jail is the same jailhouse where the women who challenged President Wilson on suffrage in 1919 were taken, and also similarly raised the profile of their cause.
Yes, yes, and Charles Street Jail was was famous also for one of the places that Sacco and Vanzetti were held in the 1920s.
A lot going on in those 4 walls that you can now go and have a drink in at Liberty Hotel.
Exactly. I was just thinking the same thing, and they have good cocktails. So.
It seems like his leadership during the meeting at the AME Church, the Zion AME Church, and then especially the fact that he, I think for the first time, but certainly not for the last time, spent time in jail around that incident, really changes Trotter's public persona, public image.
Yes.
But it also changes indirectly his financial standing, the fortunes of his paper, because soon after that, his business partner decides that he's not in this anymore. They split ways at that point.
Yes.
What does that mean for The Guardian, for Trotter's finances, for his relationship with his sort of family and inner circle? It seems like a very pivotal moment for him. Yeah,
it was a pivotal moment. On the one hand, it gave him national fame and notoriety. It made him, amongst working class Black people who read his newspaper in particular, somebody who people took a lot of pride in. And the Guardian began to sell as far west as we know is Oklahoma and California, and so it distributed across the country and eventually across and into the Caribbean. So it raised his profile that way. But George Forbes, who was his partner in The Guardian, was somebody who was a businessman. So George Forbes knew that you can't just have a newspaper and not manage the finances and not go after subscriptions and not, have these very rigid ways of advertisement policy. And Forbes left the newspaper after the Boston riot. Because Forbes' argument was that the newspaper was never kind of a moneymaker, and that it was not sustainable over the long term. George Forbes was also threatened by Booker T. Washington for supporting The Guardian. So Forbes left. Trotter then runs the newspaper by himself with like a cohort of friends and supporters. But really, the newspaper, until his wife's death in 1918, was run and managed by his wife and by his mother and his sisters. And Trotter himself was never good at money, right? So one of his policies was that he refused to accept advertising revenue from skin bleaching companies or hair straightening companies. That's was a huge form of revenue. And so he's basically just relying on sales. And he was also so much involved in the cause that he would argue, well, if you can't pay this amount of money, you don't need to pay for the subscription, just show up at one of our protests, right? So he was not a business person. And luckily, his inheritance that his father eventually was released to him could buy him some time. So he and his wife purchased a house in Dorchester, an area that at the time was predominantly white. They continued to run the newspaper. Trotter works and continues to have his real estate business, but then decides to focus on the paper full time. But then as the years go on, it quickly becomes clear that that was not sustainable because he was never making money from the paper. He was publishing the paper and going places and talking and testifying before Congress and all these things, but he wasn't making money off of the newspaper itself. And so by the time you get to World War I, the paper was really popular amongst people who read it and people who were diehard fans of it, but it was not something that was going to be a bestseller. And it was also not something that could compete with kind of the advances in newspaper technology that took place in the early 20th century, right? He didn't have the same type of photographs that other newspapers had. So if you look at copies of his paper by like 1910, you look at something like the Chicago Defender, the Guardian looks pretty paltry in comparison. Just in terms of presentation. So by the time you get to World War I, had to remortgage his house multiple times. He moves out of his home in Dorchester. He and his wife are middle-aged and they're rooming with roommates and with supporters rather than having their own house and just keeping the paper running.
You mentioned that downward slide in their finances, and especially the move to the South End or Lower Roxbury, though it's damaging for them as a family. You wrote that it sort of endeared him to his constituency or to his readers. And he's courting a very different group of readers than a lot of the other papers. You describe a term you use a lot throughout the book as the genteel poor.
Yes.
Who do you picture as the genteel poor that are his readers and his supporters?
So genteel poor was a term I borrowed from Dorothy West, her interviews about growing up in Boston. And she would say that the genteel poor were the majority of African-American people in the city of Boston and its surrounding areas who did not make a lot of money. Most of them worked in what we would now call like the service industry. You had a small cohort of people who were teachers and professionals, but mostly these people, even though they were considered poor by Boston standards and had the lowest incomes, they were also people who were very high achieving, right? They were people who sent their kids to dance class if they could. They were people who read everything. They were people who took advantage of free nights at the Museum of Fine Arts, and people who really took advantage of resources in the city that we often don't think of that population as taking advantage of. They were very, very committed to voting. So the rate of Black voting in the city of Boston was amongst the highest in the country in 1905. And so Trotter's argument, like Dorothy West's argument, was like these were people who were poor, yes, but most of them had high levels of education. Boston's Black community had the highest literacy rate of any Black community in the country by 1910. And really, their poverty came from the systemic racism in the city of Boston, not from the fact that they were in any way a denigrated group of people. So
right, the lack of opportunity.
Lack of opportunity.
Right.
And most of them, were, as Trotter, towards the end of his life, would say, you had graduates of Brown University who were working. They couldn't get a job anywhere, so they were like the elevator man in downtown Boston. And so that was the type of population that characterized Boston at the time. And so Trotter, that became the people who read his newspaper, much more working class people, but people who, were interested in voting, people who were activists, people who were, could have conversations about, the tariff policy of William Howard Taft, right? In sort of this way that we kind of don't think of that community having. And so he really tapped into that community, the genteel poor.
So at the same time that he's tapping into his community and that his own personal finances are starting to slide, he's also embarking on movement building from, I guess you could say it starts with the New England Suffrage League, and then that builds out into much better known movements. So what was the New England Suffrage League, and then how does that get us to something like the Niagara Movement?
Okay, so the New England Suffrage League was kind of the carryover from that National Equal Rights League that Trotter was the source of why Trotter approached Washington in 1903. And the New England Suffrage League was part of these national suffrage leagues that took place mostly in the North to try to restore voting rights for African Americans across the country, and in doing that, to mobilize Black people who could vote, so Blacks could vote in the North at the time, to mobilize that population to vote in a way that was going to have a political effect on the situation of racism and discrimination across the country. And so the the New England Suffrage League was known for having fundraisers, for rallying around specific cases of disfranchisement across the South, for raising money to hire lawyers to, protest legally against segregation and discrimination. And by 1905, Trotter's popularity really caught the eye of others of his supporters throughout the North, who argued that while his approach might be off-putting, right, his main sort of political focus was what the African American community needed at the time. And so Trotter was friends with W.E.B. Du Bois. They were both at Harvard at the same time, although Du Bois was a graduate student when Trotter was an undergrad. And Du Bois gets in contact with Trotter and with other members of sort of this educated Black working middle class elite group of people who were really looking for a different political alternative. And they created the Niagara Movement, which met in Niagara Falls in 1905, and eventually argued that the goal of that movement was to use legal support to undermine laws that were passed after Reconstruction that limited the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. And so Trotter was really, he was referred to by Du Bois as the John the Baptist of the Niagara Movement, because he basically put the platform, his ideas were that the organization had to be nonpartisan, that it had to be committed to activism and agitation for civil rights.
As this John the Baptist figure, he's sort of presaging a national movement. He's helping to put it into action.
Yes.
But then he's not, in the end, leading that movement. In fact, he's sort of forces the organization to tear itself apart, right?
Yes. The thing about Trotter that I tried to emphasize in the book is that he was, and this was what his contemporaries would say, he was, despite starting these movements, these little fires throughout kind of the Pan-Africanist and community, so that those communities themselves then changed the way they approach politics. He himself was not a movement person, because his personality always got in the way, and his rigidity always got in the way. So with Niagara Movement, he was committed to that movement being nonpartisan, right? That Black people should not be condoning, supporting the GOP or the Democratic Party or any party, because they needed to concentrate on policy. And the Niagara Movement in Boston, Du Bois hired the head of the Niagara Movement in Cambridge was a man named Clement Morgan, who Trotter believed was against him. And Trotter also believed that Morgan was a Republican. He was aligned with the previous governor of Massachusetts. And so Trotter believed that this was betraying principles. And through that, then basically, I argue in the book, right, throws this, adult-sized temper tantrum, makes it very difficult for Du Bois to organize and hold meetings. That is one of the sources of the collapse of that organization.
And it sounds like the next time that he works with Du Bois, it follows kind of the same trajectory, because soon after the Niagara Movement sort of falling apart, they work together again on what becomes the NAACP. But then Trotter almost seems to be working against it. So he's helping to build these movements, then not really participating in them. What was his preferred instrument of change at that time?
Well, I would say that because he was a radical, he did not like the idea that civil rights groups were not led and decided, and their agenda controlled by African American communities themselves. And so the NAACP was a perfect example. It was formed by a group of white liberals, mostly in New York and New England, with the express purpose of doing what Trotter wanted to do, which was enforce the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. So in that way, Trotter won that argument, because by 1909, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment was considered by reformers as, okay, this is where our fight has to lie. But Trotter's problem with the NAACP was that it didn't have Black leaders. And in fact, it wasn't until after World War I that it even had branches in the South. And it was really in terms of the political trajectory, many African Americans, but particularly Trotter, saw it as very elitist, right? So it really was focused on using the legal system to combat segregation and disfranchisement. And that's a slow process, as we know, right? So the NAACP's program was that they would choose cases that they believed they could win to challenge local laws that were discriminatory. And so Trotter's argument was that in doing that, the NAACP was far removed from the everyday existence of African Americans, that it was too conservative, and that really until the late 19-teens, it didn't have Black leadership. And so that was his criticism of the NAACP, and he created the Negro Independent Political League to counter that, and basically argued that they were the ones who was going to be led by Black people. They would have people in Black communities elected. They would decide what it was that they were fighting for. They would raise the money themselves. And he would argue that white people could join. So one of his big supporters were Tom Milholland, who was a white activist out of Alabama. They could join. John Honey Fitz, the Kennedys, patriarch, he was a big supporter of that group, of Trotter's group as well. So they could join and they could support it, but they couldn't decide the direction of it. And so that really, if we look at, in addition to his prickly personality and his, mercurial nature, ideologically, that was really something that was constant. Was he wanted Black communities themselves to be able to control the terms of their own appeals for justice.
Although he's not active with the organizations that we remember today, like the NAACP, for very long, he is using his membership and leadership in these other more radical groups to maintain a very high level of visibility, because we know he's going to be a critic of Teddy Roosevelt and President Taft, and then he's going to have a lot of back and forth and personal audiences with President Woodrow Wilson. Mm-hmm. How does Monroe Trotter go from being an early, albeit uneasy, supporter of candidate Wilson to being one of the biggest critics of President Wilson?
So it's a good question. I mean, Woodrow Wilson was a Democrat. Woodrow Wilson was governor of New Jersey before he became president. Woodrow Wilson, however, before he ran for president, was somebody who had not yet, did not have a record of the virulent type of public federal anti-Black legislation that, say, a Roosevelt or a Taft did. So Trotter's big criticism of Roosevelt was with the Brownsville incident that took place in Texas, also with Roosevelt's writings about African-American soldiers during the Spanish-American War, and all these types of things. And for Roosevelt's support of southern states that did not prosecute against lynching. So by the time Woodrow Wilson was running for president, Trotter, and as I point out in the book, other Black Northerners like Du Bois were weary of the GOP and were really arguing that Black people needed to vote locally, at least, for those who supported Black civil rights. And if that was not Republicans, they should vote Democrat, or if it was, a workermen's party or whatever party had you. So by the time Woodrow Wilson was running for president, Wilson himself accepted overtures from African Americans in New Jersey, who approached him as governor and praised him initially because Woodrow Wilson was involved in preventing a lynching that was about to arise in New Jersey in 1910. So he had kind of a support of local Black support, which is funny now when we kind of look at his statements about African American people. But that was him, and we have to think of in the time. You
think of the spectrum of what white people were doing in general, and maybe it didn't seem so bad against that background.
Yes, against that background, exactly. And so Woodrow Wilson, Trotter, and his league approached Wilson and actually met with him. And to give an idea of how revolutionary that was seen at the time, Wilson was actually threatened by Southern Democrats for agreeing to meet with Black Northerners. So
yeah, that was going to be my next question.
Yeah.
How typical would it have been for a presidential candidate to meet with members of the Black community at that time?
It's not that it didn't happen. It's that when Trotter met with Roosevelt, he's meeting with him as a representative of an all-Black group. So he was coming in and saying, we are a Black group of people. We want to meet with you. And Woodrow Wilson, unlike everybody else who would kind of just ignore him, says, okay, and has them meet with him. They meet with him, and Woodrow Wilson basically says, well, I don't know what I can do for race relations, but I will do my best to be fair. And in the context of 1912, 1916, that was a pretty bold statement to say, because this was at a time when most Republicans and all Democrats were arguing that, racial segregation was not harmful, racial discrimination and disfranchisement were not problems. So Trotter rallied for the first time and only time in his life. He publicly supported a presidential candidate. He urged Black Northerners, who were considered a swing vote at the time, to rally around Woodrow Wilson. And Woodrow Wilson won the presidency. And he won by margins in northern states where the Democrats had not won national elections in years. So Trotter then takes that as a sign that the Black community should confront and hold the Wilson administration responsible because they were responsible for getting Wilson elected in the North. And so when Woodrow Wilson, almost immediately when he entered office in March 1913, when Woodrow Wilson immediately segregates the federal government. It was one of the first things he did within 3 weeks of taking office. And also Woodrow Wilson appointed avowed white supremacists and white Southerners who approved of lynching to his cabinet. Trotter goes and confronts him in his office twice. And I argue in the book that the significance of this was much more than merely, getting some press out of it. Trotter really mobilized and galvanized a generation of Black people who were not used to seeing African American people boldly confront elected officials about their dismal racial policy, right? I gave a talk a couple of weeks ago, and somebody asked, well, that seems pretty amazing now because you don't even see that now. Like a group of people showing up and confronting an elected official, never mind the president of the United States, and saying, this is your record on this, and this is how it has affected us, and why are you, how do you answer that, right?
Right.
And when he did that, that really gave him a level of celebrity amongst working class Black Northerners, and respect across the African diaspora, because it was the first time anyone had done that, and for, I would argue during that time was the only time somebody had approached the president on his racial record in that way.
So it sounds like Trotter then uses the fame or the notoriety he gains for those confrontations to help build a new National Race Congress. And then he uses that group to put pressure on Wilson's reelection campaign. What were they asking for in the 1916 election?
The Liberty League, as they eventually called themselves, were really arguing that again, for the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment to be supported, but specifically for some type of federal anti-lynching legislation, because lynching, despite sort of declining slightly in the early 1900s, was on the rise in the era of World War I. And so their argument was that, particularly as Europe devolved into war and the United States was remaining neutral, that this was a time to completely remake what kind of democracy in the world would look like. And that in addition to self-determination for, those in Eastern Europe, in the beginning of World War I, that African American communities needed self-determination through the vote and also through federal protection against lynching and racial violence. Although, of course, Woodrow Wilson did not sort of heed that call, and Wilson actually was a big supporter of D.W. Griffith's film The Birth of a Nation, which came out in 1915. And Trotter's argument was basically that that film encapsulated kind of what life was like for African Americans during the Wilson years, and that he and his Liberty League argued that in order to seek true racial freedom, but also racial justice, was for legislation, but also for organizing African American people across the diaspora.
And I'll just pause to shamelessly plug one of our past episodes for our listeners who haven't heard it, to check out episode 121, which is all about Trotter's fight against Birth of a Nation in Boston. So shameless plug on my part.
Yes, no problem.
After this shameless plug, I'll also give a fair warning to our listeners that there's going to be a lot of sad and disappointing news about the life of Monroe Trotter from here on out, because it sounds like the 1916 campaign and the Liberty League are kind of the high point of Trotter's influence, his popularity, sort of his national reach. The Guardian is hitting hard times at this point. What do you think was going wrong, and why was Trotter personally enjoying more success than the paper at that point?
Well, I would say that by the time you get to World War I, there is definitely a shift in the notion that newspapers, particularly black newspapers, in order to gather the type of audiences that would keep a paper alive, had to be more than what the Guardian was, which the Guardian was local, it was satirical, as Du Bois would say, it was fiercely political. People who read it loved it, and people talked about it, and it was good at stirring up conversation and rallying people politically. But it was not, like the Chicago Defender, which had, short stories and photographs in it and, cartoons and that type of thing. Although Trotter did have cartoons, they were not, playful cartoons. They were, political cartoons against his enemy.
Right.
And so by the 19-teens and 1920s, as I say in the book, the political culture of newspapers had fundamentally changed. And he did not change with those things. So that was one of the problems. The other problem was that even though his personality, his confrontations made him somebody who was difficult to get along with and never became a movement person, all the things that Trotter argued for eventually became mainstream civil rights arguments by the 1920s. So a federal anti-lynching bill, the Dyer anti-lynching bill, is submitted in 1920s with help from Trotter. That became kind of mainstream, accepted by white reformers. His notion that the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment had to be enforced, that became, by the 1920s, the rhetoric of the NAACP. The notion that black people needed to have a say in how it was that they became free, that became, the rhetoric of both black nationalists and the rising sort of black socialist movement in New York City. So everything that he argued for eventually became mainstream, which is kind of the tragedy and the triumph of his life. The public and activists eventually came around to what Trotter was saying. Trotter himself, however, was definitely at the vanguard of that. And so at his time, he was not recognized as changing the landscape as much as he actually was.
Now, as we get into the teens, Monroe Trotter had a series of health problems that you diagnosed as being psychosomatic. What do you think was going wrong with him, sort of 1915, 1916?
Well, I say in the book that I would say, I'm not a doctor, so I couldn't say, that there was nothing wrong with him. I would say that throughout his life, and particularly towards the end of his life, he had all of these ailments that develop. So one of them is he gets like a boil on the side of his neck that has to be lanced. He suffered, from the time he was a child, he suffered from lung problems and breathing problems. And he was born prematurely. But throughout his life, he was definitely seen as somebody who was very, very moody, and somebody who often at these moments would have, physical ailments, that when you're reading the historical record, it's like, is this a real thing or is it not a real thing, or what's actually going on? And then suddenly he'd just like bounce back out of it and be his old self. And so part of the source of what I argue in the book, the source of some of his inner turmoil was that the paper was not making money. In 1918, his wife, Deanie, died of the Spanish flu, or the epidemic of 1918. And she was not expected to die. So she was actually came down with the flu. He checks in with her. She says she's doing fine. He goes to give a speech in Chicago. On the train on the way back, he finds out from somebody else that she died. So very dramatic moment. She basically ran the newspaper. So now he's alone running the newspaper. And also he never had any children. I think he entered a period of his life, again, based on the historical record, where that isolation, or his career was very isolating. So he wasn't into boys who had kids and a wife and like a community, although he had all these supporters. And so by the 1920s, even though his rhetoric and his politics were really taken up by younger activists in Harlem and New York and Jamaica and the Caribbean, he really was considered somebody who was like a relic of the past, and not somebody who a lot of people were close to.
I'm just going to back up to something you glanced over, because I've been, for very obvious reasons, thinking a lot about the 1918 flu recently.
Yes.
And I walk in the Fairview Cemetery. It's just very close to my house. So I walk in the cemetery sometimes and I've just really been taking stock of all the 1918 inscriptions recently, which Deanie is one. What was she doing at the time she got exposed to the flu? What sort of work was she doing that led her into that exposure?
So one of the things that I delighted in when I was doing research for the book was finding out more about her life, trying to find out more about her life independently of Monroe. So even though Trotter's rhetoric was that Deanie was like his helpmeet and she was running the paper, there's actually evidence that by 1907, Deanie sort of had her own public career in service. At the time of her death, she was at the pinnacle of that because she was working for the Soldiers' Comfort Home, which was making baskets and providing pen pals and providing support for both soldiers and for civilians who were stationed in Ayer, Massachusetts, at the military base there, but also people who were suffering from the flu. And so she serviced both, or helped both, Black and white soldiers, but she was particularly concerned with young Black soldiers who were sent to train in Massachusetts, and this was their first introduction to Boston. So she was actually exposed to the disease because she made all of these gift baskets, went up to Ayer from Boston to personally give them to young people. She also, before her death, was very much involved in overturning the conviction of a Black man who was accused of murder in the 1870s. And personally corresponding with the various governors to get him released. So she had sort of her own career, even though she was running the Guardian and helping her husband. And so that career actually is what sadly led to her death. She was exposed to the flu. She came back from Ayer sick. She was one of the few people who immediately seemed to recover. tells her husband, or everyone tells her, Trotter, that she's going back out to work in the community, and then she fell ill again and died pretty quickly within about 2 weeks. So pretty tragic, and given our current circumstances, the flu and the pandemic, and that for Trotter, he definitely was not. It was not an expected death, particularly given that it was said that she was recovering.
I was really struck by how quickly Monroe's back to work, and he seems to have to really throw himself into his work at that point. Although maybe not into the Guardian fully, because it continues its financial decline. Mm-hmm. But he is really taking advantage of what a lot of radicals see as the opportunity that the end of the Great War is going to present. And we spend a fair amount of time in the book discussing this resolution that he and some of the groups he's allied with are trying to put before the peace negotiators in Paris. Will you tell the listeners a little bit about that resolution and then what it took to get Monroe Trotter to Paris and what Paris was like for him?
Okay, so he's part of this National Liberty League. It was organized by he and a radical Caribbean immigrant named Hubert Harrison in Harlem, New York. And basically their argument was that the war was not a war that was fighting for liberty of African American people or of the African kind of colonized world, but that the moment was a moment when African Americans and colonized peoples could present their demands before the world. And he and the Liberty League met in Washington, D.C. to rally for provisions within the Senate Foreign Relations Committee that would lead to a decolonization across the world, and also make civil rights of people around the world a priority of whenever the war ended. With the League of Nations, of course, Woodrow Wilson creates sort of this idea of a new freedom, right? The fact that in Woodrow Wilson's imagination, this would be a new world order. And at the Paris Peace Conference, the League of Nations was proposed, as we all know. And so Trotter's idea was that African Americans and African descended people had to be at the table to dismantle Western colonialism and exploitation of colonized people, and put the demands, as he said, of the colored people in the United States before the world. And at the time, the State Department refused to submit passports to African Americans because the argument was they were seditious in the way that they were critical of the American policy. So only 2 African Americans were given an official passport: W.E.B. Du Bois, who went on behalf of the NAACP to the Pan-African Congress, and Robert Moton, who was the president of Tuskegee. And neither Du Bois nor Moton addressed kind of the horrendous conditions that Black soldiers faced, both in the United States and in Europe, or in immediate decolonization of a majority of the world. And so Trotter and the Liberty League decided that Trotter would go and present demands, as he says, the demands of the colored people, himself to the Paris Peace Conference. And to do this, he and the Guardian and other newspaper allies had a fundraiser where African Americans could donate money to pay for his travel to Paris. Amazingly, this was a Black effort. So Black people from as far away as California and Washington State donated money. They managed to pay for his travel. But when he goes to get the passport, of course, the State Department won't allow him to go. And he immediately disguised himself as a chef aboard a ship in New York City, shaved his mustache off, which, I'm still amazed that actually worked. And then, then got on the boat and sailed for Paris, arrived in Paris just when the peace, the Versailles Conference was ending, but managed to get the demands put into the European newspapers. So, actually, Trotter's demands, the demands of the colored people, as it was called, were featured in French newspapers and English newspapers, right? And for some of the first time, Europeans and the Allies began to see how much Woodrow Wilson's administration was denigrated and despised by African Americans in the country, which was sort of an eye-opening thing to many people in Europe at the time. And that, these demands for decolonization and for civil rights were being demanded by Black people in America as well as in the colonized world. He got to Paris late. He is celebrated by various operatives in Paris, but then he is stuck there. He couldn't get back. And so there's a fundraiser to bring him back from Paris to Boston in 1919. And he becomes, once again, a celebrity amongst working class genteel poor across the country.
1919 it's a pivotal point because we have the Red Summer, May Day riot in Roxbury.
Yes.
All these things are happening almost simultaneously. So this is backlash against anything red in America, in Boston in particular. Well, that doesn't faze Trotter. What does that mean for Trotter and his radicals? How are they continuing forward in the face of this backlash?
He and his supporters, and they included a network of mostly Caribbean-born radicals in both New England and New York. They really saw this as a moment when, given the failed promises of May Day and labor reform and the violence of Red Summer, that this was an opportunity for them to mobilize people and to ally themselves with new ways of looking at the world, whether that was socialism or whether that was communism or whatever it looked like, that this was a chance to galvanize that. So Trotter became a mentor to A. Philip Randolph, who was organizing the sleeping car porters down in New York City. He became, allied with various Caribbean radicals like Cyril Briggs. And he became somebody who in contact with those younger radicals, began to argue that using arms of self-defense was the best way for Black communities to defend themselves against the rising tide of violence that was occurring in the aftermath of World War I. And so by 1920, when the beginning of the 1920s, Trotter was somebody who really began to see that Black struggle for civil rights in the United States, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, that those were still the goals, but that the way to get those goals was through self-protection for the African American community, and also through a combination of, Garveyism, socialism, and Marxist political thought at the time. By 1921, by the early 1920s, he found something called the African Blood Brotherhood, which was a secret organization that basically called upon Black communities to arm themselves against racial violence that was occurring at the time, the Tulsa race riots in particular in 1921. He called for a strengthening of labor reform and a transformation of kind of labor in Boston and across the country. And he continued to kind of to argue against the repression of Black workers and tenant farmers across the South.
And he keeps pushing for the Dyer anti-lynching bill.
Yes, the Dyer anti-lynching bill, which failed, but despite failing, the Dyer bill really changed the conversation about lynching. The United States, until recently, had never passed any form of anti-lynching, anti-mob violence national legislation. And the Dyer bill was the first to go before the House and the Senate and to have support of a large minority of legislators, right? So in other words, it kind of pushed the conversation towards lynching being Black people's fault, right, which was kind of the rhetoric at the time, to lynching being something that was illegal and should be dealt with. Of course, the bill itself did not pass, but by the 1920s, the idea that lynching was just something that was normal. By the 1920s, in other parts of the country outside the South, lynching was frowned upon.
from a 2020 lens, it's hard to imagine that a wide swath of the country at one point just believed that because Black people had these rapacious animalistic appetites that lynching was just a normal everyday response to that.
Yes, right. Yeah, and I mean, and if we're evaluating Trotter's career, I mean, he was from the beginning, from the 1890s, saying, along with Ida B. Wells, right, lynching is a crime. It is used to terrorize the Black community. It occurred much more often than people at the time, or some people even now, would like to admit that it occurred, and that there was an easy way to combat it, which was using a federal law against those types of crimes and prosecuting towns and cities that failed to protect people who were accused of a crime. So that was one of all of Trotter's movements. That was the one that, by the time he died in 1934, that became the rhetoric of people who were, of both parties, who were against lynching. Whereas in 1901, you couldn't really say that your average person, even in Boston, believes that, number one, lynching was a problem, and number two, if it was a problem, that, it was a crime.
So in this period, sort of from his return from Paris through the ultimate failure of the anti-lynching bill, Trotter's becoming more and more of a radical, embracing at least the rhetoric around using arms for Black self-defense, reacting very much to this wave, this reactionary wave that starts in 1919. But personally, you're right, he's becoming, through this same period, much more pessimistic. And then you say that observers would note that he's disheveled, he's becoming more withdrawn from polite society. What's happening to his mindset, do you think, after the defeat of the Dyer Bill?
Again, because he didn't keep a diary, it's kind of hard to definitively say, but I propose in the book that given the evidence that we have, the death of Deanie, his mother died in 1918 as well, he's basically broke. So he will spend the rest of his life living and boarding with supporters as opposed to being in his own house. That in and of itself was a strain. The other thing that was really disappointing to Trotter was that seeing how, despite the fact that the consciousness of African American people had shifted, that lynching was still a problem, right? Black people were still disenfranchised. And not only that, he started to see a lot of that virulent racism arise in Boston when it hadn't arisen in the same way before. So Boston was segregated. Yes. Did Black people have the same economic opportunities in terms of jobs? No. But Boston, given its history, had a period from roughly 1880 to 1920 where even the most conservative of conservative white person in Massachusetts would say, segregation is not good. And so we're going to pass an anti-segregation law, which Massachusetts did. It was one of the first states to do so after the Civil War. By 1920, there was a shift generally in the culture, but also in Boston generally, where that old guard kind of reform, neo-abolitionist crowd died out or became less concerned about civil rights. And so what you were left with was really a lot of lip service in New England to the liberal past, but also at the same time, lack of support for civil rights measures locally, even though Massachusetts politicians were very critical of the South and racism on a national scale. So, for instance, Boston, by the 1920s, there's a national resurgence of the Klan, and New England had a resurgence of the Klan, right? Mm-hmm. By the end of the 1920s, the Boston City Hospital was still segregated. Its nurses training school, which was one of the best in the country, would not admit African-American nurses to be trained. And the response to this, even by people who were supposedly allies of the Black community, was that, well, we didn't really know it was segregated. It's really segregated because Black and white people don't get along, that type of rhetoric. You also had, by the 1920s, a new crop of less radical leaders arise in Boston who really began to argue that what Boston needed to get rid of racial inequity was, the Urban League or a spread of the NAACP. And Trotter, given his background, didn't believe that those things were speaking to the people. He really believed that those were organizations, however valid, that were not, mobilizing your average person. And then he really was, became very bleak with the onset of the Great Depression. So Massachusetts, we often miss that Massachusetts in the Great Depression had suffered, and was one of the states, northern states in particular, that suffered the most in terms of losing jobs and losing access to what had been, a 40-year run of, give or take, economic expansion across the Bay State. And so this was devastating. For the Black community, it was doubly devastating. So Black businesses, disappeared, never came back. You had a rise in homelessness within the Black community, hunger, all those types of things that was even worse than what was occurring in the white community across the city. And with that, he really, he started to see kind of this level of despair that many people were seeing in the Depression. He had once been allied with James Michael Curley, the famous mayor. He had a falling out with Curley over Curley's racial policies, but he was also disappointed that Curley was slow to get Massachusetts allied with the New Deal programming that began or was talked about when Roosevelt was running for president for the first time. So Trotter had a lot to be disillusioned about. One of the things he discovered was this rise in segregation across Massachusetts locally. In other words, whites deciding, like in towns or in banks, that they were going to have segregation as policy, and there not being the same type of legislative response as had occurred before. And basically Massachusetts' argument being, much like many Massachusetts liberals can argue now, where we might have racial issues, but they aren't as bad as the rest of the country. So, we don't need to fix them. And so really that was a shift in Trotter's experience with the city and with New England. And he began to really despair of the fact that it appeared as though, as much as things had changed, they hadn't changed in the way that he would have suspected.
He's dedicated his life, his fortune, his good name to this cause, and maybe it hasn't moved as far as he'd like it to.
Hey, listeners, this is Jake of the Future from the editing room. Over the next few minutes, you're going to hear Kerri and I both reference Deanie a few times, when in fact we should be speaking of Maud, Monroe Trotter's sister, Maud Trotter. Sorry about that.
So it seems like just a decade from sort of the mid-20s of professional setbacks, personal tragedies, political defeats. Everything is going wrong from the mid-20s to the mid-30s. At some point, we have to discuss April 7th, 1934, Trotter's 62nd birthday. Every other profile that I've read of William Monroe Trotter treats his death as this big unsolved mystery, a lot of speculation about what might have happened. But when I read your treatment, it seems like you've made up your mind what happened.
And I will say, based on all of the newspaper evidence at the time, the writings between his family members, Deanie in particular, and the newspapers when he died, and the medical report that came out when he was picked up, there is ample evidence that he jumped from the roof.
What were the circumstances of his death for folks who haven't read the book?
So the circumstances of his death were that April 7th, 1934 was his 62nd birthday. Right before this happened, throughout 1933, he was sick. So he suffered from a very painful cyst that again grew on his neck. He moved into a apartment of one of his supporters, where he shared roughly, maybe 1,500 square feet with a mother, her grown son and various people who lived in the house. So he's in his 60s. He's living basically with roommates at the time. His mother is dead. Both of his sisters have lives of their own. And then there's the Scottsboro case in Alabama, which he rallies around supporting the vilification of the Scottsboro boys. But that was really seen as this watershed moment of, will those young men be freed or will they not be freed? So all of this is happening at the same time. And then in early 1934, he gets word that the newspaper is in such dire straits that it cannot be printed, right? That all the printers he's used in the past, and he's has all these IOUs and debts that he pays them, they refuse to get it printed. And so the paper itself is collapsing, and it actually did not, it appeared, but then it didn't appear, and it was like a rerun of other papers. It's basically collapsed. And he's told a week before he dies that the Guardian is basically over. And so he goes back to this apartment where he's staying, still very sick, and also having symptoms, as people who were around him would attest, of, wandering, not being able to sleep, seeming very confused, writing. A lot of his friends who he had known for years start to write him letters urging him, to cheer up. Basically, they realize that he's despondent, and he doesn't respond to them. His sister, a couple of days before Trotter's birthday, manages to save the Guardian, and I'm still not, there is no, all the research that I did, there is no evidence that it happened, but she agreed to pay another printer. And so the paper would be able to appear. And so Maud actually goes and tells him, right, the paper will appear. He goes to Maud's house to go over the proofs on that Friday night. And his sister and her husband basically note that he seemed very disoriented, despondent, very sad. At one point, he got up to go to another room, and he hit his head very dramatically on a stove. And basically, I was very disoriented. So they send him back to his room. He goes to sleep. The members of the house he's in, the Gibsons, check on him periodically, which is a sign that, they were concerned about his welfare. And then early in the morning, he gets up. The son in the house hears him get up, sees his shadow go up the steps, assumes that he's, fine because he's made it through the night, and then they hear the thud, and then he fell, or he was in the snow on the ground when they got there. He's picked up by the ambulance, taken to the hospital, and the hospital would rule that he jumped, right, and that he was actually, the medical examiner would say he was actually alive when they got him, and he was just in tears and not wanting to be saved. Wow. A lot of evidence that it was a suicide. I think just on that point, I would say that, when I wrote the book, I fully expect, people to say, oh, why would you say he killed himself? He's not killed himself. But I think the resistance to talking about that is kind of the resistance that people have to discussing kind of mental illness or the effects of how activism can weigh people down, particularly if you have a long life of activism. Over 30 years, he's at protests, and he's getting arrested, and he's, writing letters, and he's meeting with Congress people, and he's organizing marches. I mean, that's a long career to exist in. And so I think there's, for many people, there's still shame surrounding suicide or mental health issues. And so I think the denial of what actually happened began right around his death. So the black press immediately reported on it. And, there's telegrams, oh my goodness, Trotter killed himself. That was the rhetoric. And then Deanie, his sister, basically went to the press and basically said it wasn't true, that he didn't kill himself. And this was actually after she signed the death certificate that said he did kill himself. But her public rhetoric was that, oh, no, he accidentally fell. It was snowy. He missed his footing and he fell. And so that then became the narrative that particularly his sister wanted to preserve, which is understandable. I mean, when somebody takes their own life, often the family can have a very a reaction that they want to protect the person's privacy and protect the person's identity.
And I would say that effort was fairly successful because she seems to have muddied the waters well enough that a lot of later writers treat what happened as being unsure.
Yes. Oh, yes.
And part of the reason she has that ability to sort of curate his memory is because she goes on publishing The Guardian for how long would she keep publishing The Guardian?
She dies in the late 1950s, so she published it up until at least 1957. The last edition I found was 1957. However, her husband, Doc Stewart, continued to release issues of The Guardian that were still called The Guardian, but they weren't like weekly. They would come out, sporadically. When he dies, he then left the remnants of The Guardian / the remnants of the Black newspaper in the city to young people who were founding what became the Bay State Banner. So the effort by his sister Maud and his brother-in-law to keep The Guardian going, to really protect Monroe's reputation, they thought. Because of course they saw suicide as being, taking away from his reputation. Although we hopefully know that that's not true nowadays, right? And so
right.
They definitely were involved in sowing seeds of doubt that he had committed suicide within the community.
At the moment of his death, what was his public image or his persona? How was he remembered by the Black community at the time of his death? What were the tributes like, or the eulogies? How was he remembered at the time?
Well, I always, when people ask this on the book stuff, I always point to quotes by everyone from Marcus Garvey, who was in London at the time, to Kelly Miller, who was a Black conservative, who was no friend of Trotter's, to Du Bois's, to all these people writing in and saying that Trotter was an icon, right? Marcus Garvey said that he was the most radical Negro that Garvey had ever met.
Which is something coming from Marcus Garvey.
Exactly. Cyril Briggs, who was a leader in the African Black Brotherhood, said that he was the most, the stormy petrel of the time. This is what he called him. He basically said, younger activists owed their activism to him. A. Philip Randolph, again, would say that A. Philip Randolph always said that although he was a fan of Du Bois as a young person, Du Bois he found to be snobby. Trotter he found to be somebody who talked to people and who was really passionate and sincere. His death was covered in in newspapers in the Bahamas, in Jamaica, in Barbados, in Nova Scotia. And so there was really this outpouring of response. And his funeral was actually attended by hundreds of people, mostly Black, but also white, across Boston, who went to see to attend his funeral and to watch his burial. So that in of itself is a testament to his legacy amongst a population and a generation of people.
That might be a good place to leave it. So what was his funeral procession like?
So they actually, it was held at the 12th Baptist Church. The lines went around the block. The city itself sent in a guard to guard the casket as it made its way down the street. The most popular newspapers in Boston covered his funeral, which was unheard of for a civilian, never mind an African American civilian at the time. And tributes came in from Du Bois in particular. Du Bois was getting ready to publish an article in the Crisis magazine about peace negotiations in the Middle East. So he was really following it. It was like this big story. And he got the telegram that Trotter had died and immediately ordered that the cover of the Crisis have a picture of Trotter. So this is somebody who, they were at odds for most of their lives. He then ended up celebrating him and gave a beautiful tribute in which he, talked about his difficulties, but also Du Bois argued that he basically changed the way Black people approached themselves and approached politics.
Now, do you think for folks who read the book or listen to this interview and look back on the life and times of William Monroe Trotter, are there lessons to take for our current era?
Yeah, I think one of the big things to take is that change to racial and economically and politically unjust systems take a long time. That sounds like it would be evident, and it sounds like I'm being facetious, but I think that that's one of the things I would take, that it's a constant struggle, and that seats of power never concede unless they're constantly agitated, and that things that with agitation and with radicalism often it takes constantly agitating for them for things to change. I would also say that I think the most relevant for our time is Trotter's dedication to the idea that the press, or the media as you would now call it, needed to be independent of any political party, any agenda, and that it really needed to be exposing the truth, that was the role of the press, that it wasn't to, curry favor with anybody. It was to say, something is going on. We're going to report on it as factually as possible. And if, people are saying the facts are not correct, we will use facts to dispel their misinformation. So I definitely think that is relevant for today. And I also think it's relevant, kind of looking at Trotter's life asks us to examine how it is that Black protest and civil rights looks differently in different contexts. So I say in the book, Massachusetts never had a lynching. It never had, it had a liberal reputation, which at the time, of course, was well-deserved. And yet racial inequity and racial discrimination was rampant. And so therefore, Trotter's approach looked different in fighting white supremacy, but it didn't mean that white supremacy didn't exist in the Commonwealth.
Well, if people want to learn more about this topic, or if they want to follow you, where should they look?
I would say buy the book. I tried to make it as much. It's a very. I always joke with people. I'm like a masshole at heart, so it has a lot of It's a Boston book. It's very much about Boston and the city.
100%.
Yeah. Given coronavirus, a lot of the speaking stuff I was going to do are canceled. But in August, I am speaking at the Edith Wharton House in Lenox, where they're having, they do a good job of sort of outlining books that are of local and historical significance. So I will be there, and that's the week of August 10th and August 11th. And then I'm on Twitter at Greenidge Kerri, and I'll have more stuff in there as well.
Well, Kerri Greenidge, I just want to say thank you very much for joining us today. I've really appreciated the conversation.
Well, thank you so much. This was a pleasure. And thank you for, my background before I became a stodgy academic was in public history. So I'm somebody who really, I love when people do public history and present it to people who are not academics, but who are passionate and interested in history. So thank you.
Oh, thanks. To learn more about the life and times of William Monroe Trotter, check out this week's show notes at hubhistory.com/183. We'll have a link to purchase the book Black Radical by Kerri Greenidge, as well as a link to her Twitter. We'll also link to our earlier episodes about Monroe Trotter's fight against the movie Birth of a Nation, my interview with Millington Burgess and Lockwood, where we discuss Monroe's father, James Trotter, and some other classic episodes that are related to the conversation. And of course, we'll have a link to information about our upcoming Boston History Happy Hour. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at podcast@hubhistory.com. We're Hub History on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Or you can go to hubhistory.com and click on the Contact Us link. While you're on the site, hit the subscribe link and be sure that you never miss an episode. If you subscribe on Apple Podcasts, please consider writing us a brief review. If you do, drop us a line, and we'll send you a Hub History sticker as a token of appreciation. That's all for now. Stay safe out there, listeners.